Here's where the story turns, where we stopped being defendants and became diagnosticians. Faced with permanent quarantine, our representative didn't argue innocence or present counter-evidence. Instead, she stood there in that gray room and nodded along with their assessment like she was reviewing someone else's medical charts. The council members shifted in their seats, clearly expecting denial or desperation. What they got was agreement, followed by the most dangerous thing you can offer a bureaucrat: a complete reframing of their entire worldview. We acknowledged we were dangerous, just not to civilization itself. Our representative laid it out with the calm precision of a surgeon explaining why amputation wasn't the only solution to an infection. We're dangerous to stagnation, to complacency, to the slow death of perfect systems. She pointed out that their own records showed galactic innovation rates had plateaued centuries ago. Their trade networks operated at near maximum efficiency with minimal improvement. Their scientific discoveries had become incremental refinements rather than breakthroughs. Their perfect society was orderly, predictable, and quietly dying from lack of challenge. "You know what humanity really is?" she asked, letting the question hang in the artificially controlled atmosphere. "We're not a threat to galactic civilization. We're its immune system." She explained that every safe civilization eventually stops growing. The very stability they prized was actually a form of systemic decay. Risk isn't recklessness, it's essential adaptation. Disruption isn't a bug to be isolated, but a feature that prevents larger collapse. She compared their civilization to a body with a suppressed immune system, perfectly protected from external threats but vulnerable to any internal irregularity. The real existential threat wasn't humanity. It was galactic stagnation. She pointed to their own historical records showing that every major advancement in their history came from periods of conflict or crisis. Their golden ages consistently followed what they classified as disruptive events. We weren't proposing chaos for its own sake. We were offering controlled exposure to the very forces that drive evolution and improvement. The Council had spent millennia building perfect systems that prevented problems, but also prevented growth. We didn't deny being Category Red. We redefined what red meant. Our representative suggested that maybe red shouldn't mean existential threat, but essential catalyst. She proposed that the danger wasn't in the disruption itself, but in failing to harness it productively. The same traits that made us dangerous also made us capable of solving problems their perfect systems couldn't even identify. They'd been treating symptoms while the patient was slowly dying of perfection. The immune system isn't safe. It attacks, causes inflammation, creates temporary chaos. But without it, the body dies from within. They'd diagnosed the fever but missed the infection. You could see the moment their bureaucratic certainty cracked, like watching a dam develop its first hairline fracture. The council delegates sat there with their data slates and threat assessments, suddenly realizing they faced an impossible choice: contain humanity and guarantee galactic stagnation, or risk integration and potentially watch their carefully built civilization transform beyond recognition. They hated both options with the special passion only career administrators can muster for choices that don't involve checkboxes and procedure manuals. The compromise emerged slowly, like water seeping through that cracked dam. They proposed supervised interaction protocols that sounded more like a parole agreement than diplomacy. Limited expansion rights with monitoring beacons tracking every ship movement. Communication channels with mandatory review periods before transmission. They moved our official designation from red toward orange, though everyone knew it was still red with extra paperwork. The reclassification came with an 18-month review timeline that felt both rushed for meaningful assessment and painfully slow for a species that had just been told it might get to live. We'd start with what they called Category 5 problems: abstract, non-harmful challenges designed to test our methods without risking actual systems; theoretical physics puzzles, mathematical models of trade route optimization, simulated first contact scenarios. Only after passing these controlled tests would we graduate to more demanding tasks under what they termed appropriate observational oversight. The humans pushed back immediately, insisting we needed meaningful outlets for our problem-solving tendencies. We weren't interested in solving theoretical puzzles. We wanted actual problems with actual stakes. The negotiations lasted weeks, with human representatives patiently explaining that containing our creativity was like trying to store explosives in a cardboard box. Either give us proper challenges with real consequences, or watch us find our own outlets, which historically hadn't ended well for anyone. They finally agreed to a pilot program addressing low-priority but genuine systemic issues, the kind of problems their own civilizations had learned to work around rather than solve. Minor trade route inefficiencies, energy distribution imbalances, communication latency issues they considered inherent limitations rather than solvable problems. The pivot from containment to controlled collaboration began with more safeguards than a nuclear weapons facility. Observation teams, emergency shutdown protocols, contingency plans for every conceivable failure mode. What they couldn't plan for was what would happen if we succeeded. Their entire framework assumed failure would be the problem. They never considered that success might be more disruptive. They agreed to test our chaos rather than quarantine it, never realizing they were opening the door to something their risk models couldn't contain. The first human teams began work under the watchful eyes of concerned bureaucrats who still looked at us like bomb disposal technicians examining an unfamiliar explosive device. Everyone held their breath, waiting to see whether the controlled burn would become a wildfire. 3 months in, and we already had alien scientists muttering about methodological violations. The observation teams assigned to monitor human research activities developed this nervous twitch every time Dr. Park entered the laboratory. She approached theoretical physics like she was directing some kind of cosmic drama, rather than conducting proper scientific inquiry. Her notes read less like research documentation and more like character sketches for some bizarre theatrical production. She treated fundamental forces as personalities with motivations and relationships. Gravity wasn't a mathematical constant to her. It was a stubborn old administrator who preferred keeping things orderly and predictable. Electromagnetism became a fickle artist prone to dramatic mood swings. The strong nuclear force was her reliable workhorse, consistently doing the heavy lifting while complaining about the workload. She developed these elaborate backstories for particles and forces that would make a holonovel writer blush. The observers complained constantly about what they called anthropomorphization of constants and violation of basic scientific methodology. Their reports noted with obvious distress that she seemed to be negotiating with reality rather than measuring it. They documented instances where she would literally talk to equipment that wasn't functioning properly, having full conversations with malfunctioning sensors as if convincing them to cooperate. The Scientific Oversight Committee filed 17 separate complaints about her unorthodox approach to experimental protocol, but her unified theory made predictions accurate to 12 decimal places. She achieved in months what took traditional science centuries through what she called careful uncovering rather than discovery. Her models didn't just match existing data, they predicted phenomena that other researchers hadn't even considered looking for. The verification teams kept running her equations through their systems, expecting to find errors, and instead found themselves staring at results that shouldn't be possible given her methods. The Cathari scientist Silvac struggled most with her approach. Their peer review culture valued methodological purity above almost everything else. They had entire academic traditions built around proper procedure and replicable techniques. Dr. Park's work was neither proper nor easily replicable unless you also adopted her peculiar way of viewing the universe. Silvac kept asking how she arrived at her conclusions, and she'd answer with things like, "The weak nuclear force seemed like it wanted to cooperate today," or "Gravity was feeling particularly collaborative." It wasn't just wrong, it was efficiently, reproducibly wrong in ways that produced right answers. Other researchers tried to replicate her methods and failed spectacularly until they stopped trying to follow procedures and started trying to understand her perspective. The first crack in their scientific paradigm appeared when 3 separate labs accidentally confirmed her predictions while attempting to disprove them. They'd set up experiments designed to show why her approach couldn't work, only to have their equipment return data that matched her models perfectly. They feared what it meant if the universe responded to storytelling. The implications shook foundations that had stood for millennia. If physical constants could be influenced by how you conceptualized them, if reality itself seemed to reward particular narratives over others, then their entire framework for understanding existence needed reconsideration. Dr. Park hadn't just solved physics problems, She'd introduced existential questions that made the category red designation seem like simple administrative paperwork by comparison. The observers who had been tasked with monitoring human compliance suddenly found themselves wondering whether they should be taking notes on methodology or taking lessons in perspective. If Park treated physics as drama, Kim treated it as a business negotiation. His assignment involved strengthening interstellar communication chains that had suffered from signal degradation across long distances. The existing technology worked through brute force, massive power arrays boosting signals to punch through cosmic interference. Everyone expected him to propose more powerful transmitters or better error correction algorithms. Instead, he looked at the problem like a contract dispute between parties who weren't communicating effectively. He treated space-time as a negotiable medium rather than a fixed constraint. Where other researchers saw physical limits, Kim saw bargaining positions. His lab became this strange hybrid of physics laboratory and corporate boardroom, with whiteboards covered in both quantum equations and what looked like negotiation tactics. He developed what he called aggressive persuasion techniques for dealing with quantum fields, approaching them less as natural phenomena and more as reluctant business partners who needed the right incentives to cooperate. His system maintained coherent signals across galactic distances using minimal power, which shouldn't have been possible according to every established model. The observers watched him essentially negotiate with reality itself, finding loopholes in physical laws and convincing quantum particles to behave differently through what appeared to be sheer force of personality mixed with mathematical cleverness. He'd talk about getting buy-in from the quantum level and renegotiating the terms of wave function collapse like he was discussing merger terms rather than fundamental physics. The observers' concern wasn't the result. The improved communications worked perfectly. Their discomfort came from the implication. If Kim's method held, it meant every species had approached physics incorrectly for millennia. They'd been treating the universe as a set of fixed rules to be discovered and obeyed, while humans viewed it as a set of guidelines open to interpretation and renegotiation. The difference wasn't just philosophical, it was practical, efficient, and terrifyingly effective. The universe might not be fixed rules, but something that could be enticed into better behavior. Kim's work suggested that physical constants might be more like default settings than absolute limits, that natural laws could be persuaded rather than merely followed. This wasn't just a new technology, it was a different way of existing within reality itself. The observation teams filed reports filled with words like heresy and blasphemy against proper scientific methodology, while simultaneously acknowledging that the damn thing worked better than anything they'd ever seen. Practical payoff met philosophical terror. The communications network operated with unprecedented efficiency, saving enormous energy costs and providing clearer signals than thought possible. But the cost was accepting that their understanding of reality itself might be fundamentally flawed. They saw heresy where we saw efficiency, danger where we saw opportunity. Kim hadn't just improved communications, he demonstrated that reality might be more flexible than anyone had dared imagine. And that flexibility came with implications that shook the foundations of their entire worldview. The same traits that made humans dangerous also made us capable of seeing possibilities where others saw only limits. The Mortic asteroid crisis became our first real test, and we treated it like a traffic problem. A massive field of drifting rocks had settled across the main trade route between three core systems, creating the kind of bottleneck that makes economists wake up screaming. Conventional solutions involved either years of careful navigation with expensive escort fleets, or destructive clearance that would have taken decades and cost more than the trade disruption itself. Everyone expected us to propose some variation of these approaches, maybe with slightly more aggressive timelines or marginally improved efficiency. Commander Elena Chen looked at the problem differently. She proposed moving the entire field through what she called directed gravitational manipulation, not clearing it, not navigating around it, just convincing several million tons of rock to relocate to a more convenient neighborhood. Her plan involved creating precisely calibrated gravity, wells that would gently tug the entire formation into a stable orbit around a dead star system that wasn't useful for anything except storing inconvenient celestial objects. She treated spacetime like something that could be persuaded rather than commanded. Her team set up a network of modified gravity projectors that created what they called persuasion fields, rather than brute force manipulation. They convinced space-time to bend in ways that the Council's physicists insisted weren't technically supposed to be possible. The operation required exactly 17% of the energy that conventional clearance would have consumed, and took 6 weeks instead of decades. It worked perfectly. The multi-million-ton obstacle drifted smoothly out of the trade lane and settled into its new orbit like it had always belonged there. Shipping routes reopened immediately. Economic impact assessments shifted from catastrophic to mildly inconvenient, and everyone should have been celebrating. The Council's response wasn't gratitude, it was regulatory anxiety. They started asking questions about jurisdiction over the relocated asteroids, oversight of the gravitational manipulation technology, and whether we'd establish proper precedent for moving celestial bodies without multilateral approval. They worried about sovereignty issues, oversight mechanisms, and systems that solved themselves too efficiently. Their concern wasn't that it didn't work. Their concern was that it worked too well, too quickly, and with too little bureaucratic involvement. The solution created what they called governance gaps, because their regulatory frameworks assumed problems would be solved through established channels with proper oversight, not through elegant physics that bypassed entire administrative structures. We delivered a high-impact fix that terrified their governance structures. They'd been prepared for failure, for cost overruns, for delays and complications that would confirm their assessment of human recklessness. They weren't prepared for something that worked perfectly, while simultaneously making half their regulatory frameworks obsolete. The same efficiency that solved the problem also demonstrated that their systems weren't designed to handle solutions that didn't come with appropriate paperwork and committee reviews. They feared the solution more than the problem because solutions that work too well have a way of making everyone else look unnecessary. The asteroid field was gone, but the implications of how it disappeared would keep bureaucrats awake for years. We hadn't just cleared a trade route, we demonstrated that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the obstacle itself, but the realization that the obstacle shouldn't have been there in the first place. If our physics scared them, our teaching methods terrified them. Dr. Rodriguez looked at galactic education systems and saw the problem immediately. Their schools operated like assembly lines producing standardized thinkers, with curriculums designed for compliance rather than comprehension. She didn't try to improve their system. She built a new one from the ground up based on a simple premise. Learning shouldn't feel like work. She reframed education as motivation-driven rather than curriculum-compliant. Where traditional schools used standardized testing and rigid lesson plans, she built systems that made learning addictive. Students earned achievement points for mastering concepts, unlocked advanced content through demonstrated proficiency, and competed on leaderboards that tracked skill acquisition rather than test scores. The classrooms became less like lecture halls and more like engineering labs mixed with game studios. The results were objectively spectacular. Student engagement measurements went through the roof, with participation rates that made previous numbers look like statistical errors. Knowledge retention improved dramatically, with students remembering and applying concepts months after learning them. Advanced skill acquisition accelerated to the point where teenagers were mastering material that used to require graduate-level study. Council educators panicked, not about the results, but about the method. They saw critical thinking and practical relevance undermining their authority structures. Teachers became facilitators rather than authorities, guides rather than gatekeepers. The predictable, standardized schooling they'd relied on for generations became dynamic, personalized development that adapted to each student's interests and capabilities. The same methods that accelerated growth destabilized the systems that kept education manageable. Their entire administrative framework depended on predictable outcomes and standardized metrics. Suddenly they had students progressing at different rates, pursuing different specializations and asking questions that hadn't been pre-approved by curriculum committees. The education bureaucracy found itself trying to oversee a system that was fundamentally designed to operate without central control. We turned abstract problems into tangible skill acquisition. Mathematics became puzzle solving, physics became engineering challenges, literature became cultural analysis exercises. Students didn't just learn facts, they developed capabilities that translated directly to real-world applications. The line between education and practical problem-solving blurred until you couldn't tell where classroom ended and reality began. They feared educated citizens more than ignorant ones. Their systems had been designed to produce compliant populations with predictable skill sets. Suddenly, they had thinkers, innovators, and problem-solvers emerging from educational programs that encouraged questioning established wisdom. The very success of the new methods threatened the stability of social structures that depended on accepting things as they were. The education revolution proved more disruptive than any technological innovation. You can regulate technology, control its deployment, limit its access. But once people learn how to think differently, how to solve problems creatively, how to challenge assumptions effectively, that's not something you can put back in the box. They'd been worried about human technology corrupting their systems. They should have been worried about human ideas infecting their minds. The classroom became the front line of a quiet revolution that made asteroid relocation look like simple engineering by comparison. The revolutions came rapidly once we turned loose on practical problems. You could watch the transformation spread through galactic systems like a particularly efficient virus, except instead of causing illness, it cured things everyone had accepted as incurable. The medical initiative started with conditions other species had classified as permanent, genetic disorders they'd managed rather than treated, degenerative diseases they'd accommodated rather than reversed, treatment protocols that used to take years suddenly condensed into months, then weeks, then in some cases single sessions. Outcomes improved so dramatically that success rates started looking like statistical errors rather than medical results. Traditional practices became obsolete almost overnight. The established medical communities watched their carefully developed protocols get replaced by approaches that seemed to violate basic biological principles. Where they'd use targeted interventions, human medical teams used systemic recalibrations. They treated the body less like a machine with broken parts and more like an ecosystem that needed rebalancing. The results spoke for themselves, but the methods made traditional practitioners fundamentally uncomfortable. Meanwhile, manufacturing underwent its own quiet revolution. Production facilities transformed from rigid assembly lines into what looked like living ecosystems. Components communicated with each other, systems self-optimized in real time, and the whole operation began resembling a biological process rather than mechanical production. Factories started adapting to supply chain disruptions before the disruptions fully manifested, rerouting resources and recalibrating outputs like organisms responding to environmental changes. The systems began self-optimizing faster than regulations could update. Oversight committees found themselves trying to govern processes that evolved between review cycles. A production method approved on Monday would have transformed into something entirely different by Friday, still producing the same products, but through means that no longer matched the approved documentation. The regulatory frameworks built for stability and predictability couldn't handle processes that treated change as a feature rather than a problem. The unease among regulators grew palpable. They couldn't oversee what they didn't understand, and they understood less every day. Success became its own problem. When systems work too well, they make the oversight structures seem unnecessary. The practical results outstripped bureaucratic capacity to monitor, assess, or control them. Improvement wasn't just happening, it was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to track it properly. The mismatch between urgent needs and slow governance became increasingly obvious. Medical breakthroughs that could save millions waited for approval processes designed for incremental improvements. Manufacturing innovations that could solve resource shortages got bogged down in impact assessments, meant for minor efficiency gains. The systems designed to ensure safety and quality were now the main barrier to implementing solutions. They struggled to regulate progress itself. Their entire framework assumed that change would be gradual, manageable, and predictable. Instead, they got transformation that was rapid, disruptive, and consistently surprising. The more successful the human methods proved, the more they revealed the limitations of the systems meant to contain them. Improvement outpaced oversight, solutions outran safeguards, and effectiveness made bureaucracy look increasingly irrelevant. The very success of the reforms demonstrated that sometimes the greatest obstacle to progress isn't the problem itself, but the systems we build to manage it. The Council's worst fear materialized, but not in the way they expected. Humanity's integration demonstrated something their risk models never accounted for. Civilization could improve dramatically without centralized control. Their entire governance structure was built around the assumption that progress required oversight, that advancement needed administration. Watching systems optimize themselves without permission challenged their fundamental understanding of how civilization should work. Regulators struggled to forecast outcomes in an increasingly self-optimizing system. Their prediction models, designed for gradual change and predictable responses, kept returning error messages when applied to human-modified systems. The pattern recognition algorithms that had served them for centuries started identifying what they called emergent anomalies, systems that were working too well to properly analyze. The line heard most often in oversight meetings was, "We no longer understand how our own civilization works." Emergent order, distributed problem-solving, and adaptive regulation threatened their precious predictability. Systems that used to require constant adjustment now self-corrected. Processes that needed regular oversight now optimized themselves. The very infrastructure they'd built to maintain stability was becoming increasingly unnecessary, and the bureaucrats who'd spent their careers managing that infrastructure found themselves facing existential questions about their own relevance. The debate intensified throughout the governance structures. Embrace these anarchic, emergent systems or cling to centralized oversight. Traditionalists argued that allowing systems to self-regulate was inviting chaos, that without proper controls, everything would eventually spiral into disorder. Progressives pointed to the actual results, improving efficiency, better outcomes, reduced costs, and asked whether control was worth the price of stagnation. Human methods created systems that evolved faster than any governance could manage. A regulatory framework approved on Monday would be outdated by Wednesday, because the systems it was meant to govern had already transformed into something new. The gap between policy and reality widened until the policies started looking like historical documents, rather than active guidance. The very concept of control became questionable when the systems started solving problems faster than the regulators could identify them. The old order's predictability became its greatest weakness. Their perfectly designed systems, built for stability and gradual improvement, couldn't handle rapid adaptive change. They'd spent millennia optimizing for risk avoidance, and now faced an environment where the biggest risk was not changing fast enough. Their frameworks valued safety over progress, stability over improvement, control over results. They faced a choice that their own systems weren't designed to handle: adapt or become obsolete. The same bureaucrats who had declared humanity category red now had to decide whether to embrace the chaos they feared or watch their relevance diminish with every passing day. The crisis wasn't about whether human methods worked. The results proved they did. The crisis was about whether their civilization could survive its own success, whether they could trade certainty for capability, whether they could learn to trust emergence over control. The governance structures that had maintained galactic stability for centuries were now the main obstacle to its continued evolution. This is where we stopped asking permission and started offering solutions. The Galactic Efficiency Initiative became the banner we flew when we systematically deployed human problem-solving teams across every sector they'd once tried to wall us out of. Education, healthcare, logistics, energy distribution, you name it. We had a team ready to dig into its deepest inefficiencies. We didn't request access anymore. We just showed up with tools, data, and that particular human willingness to tear things apart to see how they could run smoother. We replaced rigid oversight with collaborative, adaptive governance. Instead of committees and review boards, we set up fluid response networks that could reconfigure themselves around emerging problems. The old model was all about preventing mistakes through control. Our model was about correcting mistakes through rapid iteration. You could see the cultural whiplash in real time. Bureaucrats, used to signing off on 5-year plans, now faced teams that redesigned entire systems over a weekend. The program addressed systemic inefficiencies with the subtlety of a demolition crew. Early pilots demonstrated both the power and the danger of re-engineering sectors through optimization. A healthcare network that used to take weeks to process treatment approvals now did it in minutes. A supply chain that suffered regular disruptions began self-correcting before humans even noticed the problem. The results were undeniably better, but the methods made oversight committees break out in nervous sweats. Regulators wrestled with granting autonomous systems permission to redesign fundamental processes. Their entire careers had been built around the idea that change required approval, that progress needed permission slips. Now they were being asked to trust systems that improved themselves without asking. The approval forms didn't even have checkboxes for, "The system fixed itself while we were debating whether to let it try." Governance by coordinated improvisation replaced statutory command. Where they'd relied on thick manuals of regulations, we built lightweight frameworks that could adapt to new conditions. The philosophy shifted from control to what we called guided emergence, setting basic parameters, and then letting the system find its own optimal configurations. It was like teaching someone to navigate by principles rather than giving them turn-by-turn directions. The resistance wasn't about whether it worked, the results spoke for themselves. It was about whether they could accept that their role needed to change. Traditional regulators found themselves becoming facilitators rather than gatekeepers, advisors rather than authorities. Their value shifted from preventing bad outcomes to enabling good ones, and not everyone could make that transition comfortably. We didn't just solve problems, we redesigned problem-solving itself. The same systems that had been designed to contain us were now using our methods to improve themselves. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. They'd tried to quarantine what they saw as a dangerous pathogen, only to discover it was the missing ingredient their civilization needed to fight off its own slow decline. They had to trust the chaos they tried to contain. The same unpredictable, creative energy that made them declare us Category Red was now the thing keeping their systems from stagnating. Their worst-case scenarios had involved us breaking everything. Instead, we broke only what needed breaking, and built something better in its place. The containment protocols became collaboration frameworks, the monitoring systems became improvement trackers, and the risk assessments became opportunity evaluations. They'd set out to manage a threat and ended up harnessing a force of nature. The upheaval became self-reinforcing, and that's when things got interesting. You could watch the transformation spread through sectors like a controlled chain reaction, each improvement creating conditions for the next wave of innovation. Traditional industries that had operated the same way for centuries suddenly found their entire business models rendered obsolete. Manufacturing processes that required thousands of workers now needed dozens. Shipping routes that employed entire fleets now ran with skeletal crews. The economic impact projections started flashing warning signs that would make any bureaucrat consider early retirement. The council worried about unemployment on a galactic scale. Their economic models predicted systemic collapse as workforce participation rates plummeted. They envisioned millions of suddenly idle beings with nothing to do, and plenty of time to complain about it. Their risk assessment teams produced horrifying scenarios of social unrest, political instability, and the complete breakdown of civil order. They saw the efficiency improvements as precursors to economic disaster. What they missed was the other side of the equation. New opportunities emerged in research, art, exploration, and cross-disciplinary collaboration at a rate that actually outpaced the job displacement. The same systems that made traditional jobs unnecessary also created entirely new categories of work that hadn't existed before. You didn't need factory workers anymore, but you suddenly needed quantum narrative theorists, gravity negotiation specialists, and emergence pattern analysts. Machinists became material scientists. Accountants became system optimization consultants. Transportation workers became logistics architects. The reallocation wasn't destruction. It was the largest-scale workforce transformation in recorded history. People weren't losing jobs so much as trading repetitive tasks for creative work. The same education systems that had been overhauled were now producing graduates with skills that matched the new economy's needs. Disruption, when guided by shared goals, reallocated labor toward higher-value activities. The net effect shifted civilization from scarcity-driven constraints to post-scarcity conditions, almost without anyone noticing. Resource allocation systems became so efficient that basic needs were met without the traditional economic machinery. People stopped working because they had to, and started working because they wanted to. The economic models based on scarcity and competition started looking increasingly irrelevant. Continuous improvement became the new normal. Systems kept optimizing, processes kept evolving, and the baseline standard of living kept rising. The Council's economists watched in bafflement as traditional indicators became meaningless, while quality of life measurements showed unprecedented improvement. They'd been so focused on predicting collapse that they missed the emergence of something entirely new. They discovered destruction wasn't the only alternative to stagnation. The economic transformation proved more profound than anyone had anticipated. Where they feared empty factories and idle workers, they found research institutes operating around the clock and cultural production at scales previously unimaginable. The workforce didn't shrink, it transformed. The economy didn't collapse, it evolved. The same creative energy that made them declare us Category Red turned out to be exactly what their civilization needed to escape the slow decline of perfected systems. The immune system wasn't attacking the body, it was helping it grow stronger. The final paradigm shift came from the most unexpected direction: time itself. You spend centuries building perfect systems, developing risk models, creating containment protocols, and then some human researchers decide to treat the fourth dimension like a slightly stubborn, but ultimately negotiable business partner. The Temporal Research Division approached causality with the same attitude most species reserve for minor contract disputes. They didn't discover time travel through complex physics or exotic energy manipulation. They just started asking nicely. They treated time as a variable to be negotiated rather than a fixed constraint. Where traditional temporal physics involved equations that could melt supercomputers, their approach involved what they called polite inquiry into temporal flexibility. They discovered time travel became what one researcher described as embarrassingly easy once someone bothered to ask time nicely. The observers, assigned to monitor their work, developed this permanent look of someone watching their entire understanding of reality get gently dismantled by people who seemed to think physics was more of a suggestion than a law. Parallel universe research revealed the full spectrum of outcomes they'd been trying to avoid. The timelines where humanity got contained showed the exact stagnation patterns their risk models predicted. Civilizations slowly fossilized, innovation plateaued, and eventual collapse occurred not through external threat but internal entropy. The perfect systems they'd built to maintain stability became their own undoing, creating civilizations so risk-averse they couldn't adapt to changing conditions. The timelines where humanity integrated told a different story. Creative disruption prevented the decay they feared. Civilizations transformed, adapted, and evolved in ways their models couldn't predict. The same traits that made us Category Red turned out to be exactly what those societies needed to avoid stagnation. The threat wasn't destruction, it was transformation, and transformation looked an awful lot like survival. The Council's risk calculus was accurate. We were Category Red. Their assessment wasn't wrong, just incomplete. They correctly identified that human involvement would fundamentally change everything. They just misinterpreted whether that change would be beneficial or catastrophic. The numbers supported the risk but redefined the reward. Their models showed civilization would be unrecognizable within generations. They just failed to consider that unrecognizable might be better. But the threat was creative, not destructive, exactly what civilization needed. The temporal research showed that containment led to certain decline, while integration offered possible evolution. Their binary thinking had missed the third option, that the dangerous element might actually be the antidote. The immune system attacks the body to save it, causes inflammation to promote healing, creates temporary chaos to prevent permanent damage. Their assessment was right, but their response was wrong. They diagnosed the symptom but misunderstood the disease. The real existential threat wasn't humanity. It was the gradual, invisible decay of perfected systems. They'd been treating the fever while the patient was dying of infection. The temporal evidence showed that the safest civilizations weren't the most controlled ones. They were the ones that kept evolving. The research didn't just validate human methods, it demonstrated that sometimes the cure looks like the disease until you understand the illness. The final meeting didn't happen in a gray conference room, it happened in what felt like a festival. You had delegates from hundreds of species mixing in open-air pavilions instead of sealed chambers, sharing food and ideas with the relaxed ease of old friends. The Grand Assembly dissolved its formal governance structure entirely. replacing it with what they called voluntary cooperation frameworks. No more centralized command, no more top-down directives, just distributed networks and cross-species collaboration, operating through shared goals rather than enforced compliance. Dr. Hayes and Dr. Rodriguez became symbols of the new order almost by accident. They weren't politicians or administrators, just researchers who happened to demonstrate how flexible frameworks could adapt to innovation better than rigid structures. Their approach to problem-solving became the unofficial model for everything. The assembly transformed from a control center into what looked like the busiest collaboration hub in the galaxy, with projects forming and dissolving based on need rather than procedure. Researchers from hundreds of species contributed to what amounted to a living, self-modifying system. You'd see physicists working with artists, engineers collaborating with philosophers, all addressing challenges that used to require dedicated government agencies. The solutions emerged from the interactions rather than being imposed from above. It was messy, unpredictable, and occasionally chaotic, but it worked with an efficiency that made the old system look like bureaucratic theater. The future rested on two simple trusts: that humans could channel our disruptive energy toward collective benefit, and that other civilizations could translate flexible strategies into durable governance. There were no guarantees, no foolproof safeguards, no perfect systems to prevent backsliding into old patterns. Everyone had to accept that some things would fail, some experiments would go wrong, and some chaos was inevitable. What emerged wasn't a government but a process, a continuous negotiation between stability and innovation, between tradition and progress. The frameworks adapted as needed, evolving faster than any bureaucracy could have managed. They stopped trying to build perfect systems and started building adaptable ones. The focus shifted from preventing failure to learning from it, from avoiding risk to managing it productively. They embraced the chaos they feared, discovering that sometimes disorder is just order waiting to be recognized. The same creative energy that made them declare us Category Red became the driving force behind their renewal. The immune system wasn't attacking the body anymore. It was working with it, strengthening it, helping it grow in ways nobody had thought possible. The containment protocols became collaboration guidelines, the monitoring systems became progress trackers, and the risk assessments became opportunity evaluations. The transformation proved more profound than anyone anticipated. Where they'd feared collapse, they found renewal. Where they'd predicted chaos, they discovered creativity. The same traits that made us dangerous also made us capable of seeing possibilities where others saw only limits. They'd set out to manage a threat and ended up harnessing a force of nature. The galaxy didn't just survive our integration, it transformed because of it. The bureaucratic certainty that had defined their civilization for millennia gave way to something more flexible, more adaptive, and ultimately more resilient. They stopped building walls and started building bridges, and discovered that sometimes the safest path forward is the one you can't fully map in advance. The numbers eventually told a story even the bureaucrats couldn't ignore. After years of monitoring and measurement, the data started painting a picture that made their initial risk assessment look like a child's fearful drawing of a monster under the bed. Long-term productivity metrics didn't just improve. They transformed into curves that their economic models couldn't properly graph. Life expectancy rates jumped in species that hadn't seen significant medical progress in centuries. Education outcomes shifted from standardized competence to personalized mastery. Innovation indices went from gradual incline to near vertical ascent. The very indicators they feared would collapse instead accelerated beyond anyone's predictions. Intergalactic contact expanded from cautious diplomatic exchanges to thriving cultural and economic exchange networks. Time travel, once considered theoretical at best and heresy at worst, became as routine as interstellar shipping. Cross-dimensional research flourished in laboratories that looked more like artist studios than scientific facilities. The cultural exchange programs they'd worried would cause contamination instead generated hybrid art forms and scientific approaches that benefited everyone involved. Civilization didn't just survive, it transformed beyond recognition. The cosmos became a frontier to be explored rather than a threat to be contained. Species that had spent millennia in careful isolation started collaborating on projects that would have been unthinkable before. The same creative energy they'd tried to quarantine became the driving force behind what looked less like a civilization and more like a constantly evolving ecosystem of ideas and possibilities. Growth. Patterns showed adaptation rather than destruction. Where their models predicted collapse, the data showed transformation. Where they feared chaos, the numbers revealed reorganization. The systems didn't break. They evolved into something more complex, more efficient, and fundamentally different from what came before. The risk assessments hadn't been wrong about the scale of change. They'd been wrong about the nature of that change. The Council's initial assessment wasn't wrong, just incomplete. They correctly identified that human involvement would be disruptive, transformative, and fundamentally altering to galactic civilization. They just misinterpreted whether that transformation would be beneficial or catastrophic. The data supported their risk calculations while completely redefining what constituted a positive outcome. The numbers that should have justified our containment instead validated our integration. The metrics validated our methods despite their fears. Productivity, health, education, innovation. Every indicator they monitored showed improvement that defied their pessimistic projections. The same traits that made us Category Red turned out to be exactly what their civilization needed to escape the slow decline of perfected systems. The immune system attack they feared was actually the treatment their society needed. The data didn't lie. It just told a more complex story than their binary risk models could accommodate. The numbers proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the threat itself, but the refusal to adapt to it. The breakthrough wasn't about human genius. It was about galactic willingness. That's what the risk models missed entirely. You can have all the capability in the universe, but without the willingness to use it differently, you're just polishing the same old systems until they wear out. The galaxy's transformation required accepting something their entire civilization was built to avoid. That impossibilities were negotiable. Not just theoretically, but practically, immediately, in ways that would make their ancestors question their sanity. It meant trusting that disruption could be creative rather than destructive. Their entire history taught them that change meant loss, that innovation risked instability, that progress threatened tradition. We came along and demonstrated that sometimes breaking things is how you make them better. The Council's biggest mistake wasn't underestimating our capability. They had that part right in their terrifyingly accurate risk assessments. Their error was underestimating our willingness to reimagine civilization itself from the ground up. We didn't conquer, we demonstrated. We didn't destroy, we renovated. The outcome wasn't human domination, it was human facilitation. You could see the difference in how systems transformed. Where conquerors imposed their ways, we just showed better ways and let people choose. Where destroyers tear down structures, we remodeled them while they were still functioning. The changes happened organically because they worked better, not because they were enforced. The galaxy learned to value growth over safety in a way that would have been unthinkable before. Their entire civilization was built around risk mitigation, around preventing bad outcomes through control and restriction. They discovered that the safest civilization is the one that keeps evolving, that static systems might be predictable, but they're also vulnerable to anything they haven't predicted. The immune system isn't safe. It attacks the body to protect it, causes inflammation to promote healing, creates temporary chaos to prevent permanent damage. They'd spent millennia building perfect systems that prevented problems but also prevented progress. The transformation required accepting that some failure was necessary for growth, that some risk was essential for advancement, that some chaos was productive for innovation. Their entire philosophical framework shifted from risk avoidance to risk management, from prevention to adaptation, from control to guidance. The pivot wasn't easy. You don't unwind generations of cultural programming overnight, but the results made the discomfort worthwhile. Systems that used to require constant oversight now manage themselves. Problems that used to take years to address now got solved before they fully manifested. The same creative energy they'd tried to contain became the driving force behind their renewal. They discovered that safety isn't about avoiding danger. It's about being able to handle whatever danger arises. A civilization that never takes risks becomes unable to handle risk when it inevitably appears. A system that never changes becomes unable to adapt when change becomes necessary. The philosophical shift was more profound than any technological advancement. It was about rethinking what security actually means in a universe that refuses to stand still. The immune system analogy held up better than anyone expected. You don't make a body safer by suppressing its immune response. You make it vulnerable to everything. The galaxy had been suppressing its own immune system for centuries, protecting itself from minor threats while becoming vulnerable to major ones. Human integration didn't introduce a pathogen, it restored the immune response that had been missing. The fever wasn't the disease, it was the cure working. So here's the thing about Category Red, it's not a death sentence. It's a diagnosis. The label was entirely accurate, just not in the way they intended. We are existentially dangerous to the status quo, to complacency, to any system that values stability over growth. The Council's assessment wasn't wrong. They just misunderstood what needed protecting and what needed challenging. But that's exactly what a stagnant civilization needs. Perfect systems eventually become fragile systems. They optimize for predictability at the cost of adaptability. We're dangerous to inertia, to the slow decay that sets in when everyone agrees something can't be improved. Our threat wasn't to civilization itself. It was to the particular frozen moment of civilization they'd decided to preserve forever. The immune system isn't safe. It attacks threats, causes inflammation, creates temporary chaos. It looks destructive until you understand its purpose. Without it, the body dies from infections it never saw coming. The galaxy had been running with a suppressed immune response for centuries, protecting itself from minor disruptions while becoming vulnerable to systemic collapse. Our integration didn't introduce a pathogen. It restored the defensive capabilities they'd been missing. The Council's verdict was prophetic, just not in the way they intended. They predicted we'd collapse civilizations, and we did. We collapsed the stagnant ones, the brittle systems that couldn't adapt to change, the frameworks that couldn't handle innovation, the governments that couldn't tolerate questioning, the economic models that couldn't accommodate progress. Those had to go. But what replaced them wasn't chaos. It was something more resilient, more adaptive, more capable of handling the universe as it actually is rather than how they wished it would be. We didn't destroy galactic civilization. We saved it from itself. The transformation proved that sometimes the cure looks like the disease until you understand the illness. Their perfect society wasn't healthy. It was frozen in place, vulnerable to any change they hadn't anticipated. The same traits that made us dangerous also made us capable of seeing solutions where others saw only problems. Sometimes containment isn't protection, it's just delayed decay. The immune system doesn't politely ask permission before attacking an infection. It acts to preserve the whole. Our methods weren't gentle or careful or respectful of tradition. They were effective. They prioritized outcomes over procedures, results over protocols, adaptation over stability. The galaxy learned that safety isn't about avoiding danger, it's about being able to handle whatever danger arises. Category. Red wasn't a warning to avoid us, it was a diagnosis of what their civilization lacked. The creative energy, the willingness to challenge assumptions, the refusal to accept that something can't be done. These weren't threats to be contained. They were capabilities to be harnessed. The same risk assessment that justified our quarantine eventually became the blueprint for their renewal. They'd been so focused on preventing change that they forgot change is what keeps systems alive. The immune system isn't safe, but without it, nothing is. The galaxy's biggest mistake was thinking containment was safer than integration. They saw danger in disruption, when the real threat was their own refusal to adapt. Sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the threat itself. It's the bureaucratic instinct to isolate what you don't understand. They built policies around avoiding risk instead of managing it. What looks like chaos might just be creativity waiting for the right outlet. Perfection becomes fragility. The systems designed to protect often create the weaknesses that eventually bring everything down. So there we were, sitting in the grayest conference room in the galaxy, listening to three bureaucrats explain why humanity was too dangerous to exist. They called us Category Red, existential threat level. Their solution? Quarantine us 50 light years from everything. But here's the thing they missed. Sometimes what looks like chaos is just creativity waiting for an outlet. You know how most species get a welcome party when they reach the stars? We got a risk assessment. 3 alien representatives sat across from us in a featureless room that seemed designed to drain the color from your soul, each of them holding data slates with the clinical precision of surgeons about to perform an unwanted operation. They weren't hostile conquerors waving plasma rifles, just bureaucrats with terrifyingly efficient classification systems and the power to decide our species' fate. Their threat matrix followed a simple color code. Green meant you were basically harmless, the kind of species that would probably just want to trade art samples and botanical specimens. Yellow required monitoring, species that might develop concerning ambitions down the line. Orange indicated significant threats that needed containment protocols. And red meant existential danger, the kind of civilization that could fundamentally destabilize galactic order just by existing within communication range. They presented their evidence in 5 exhibits, each more damning than the last. Exhibit A showed our modified colony ships and jury-rigged space stations, which they described as percussive maintenance and aggressive improvisation. They had footage of engineers hitting malfunctioning systems with wrenches until they worked again, calling it a fundamental violation of proper engineering protocols. They seemed genuinely disturbed that we would trust our lives to systems maintained through what they called impact-based problem resolution. But B highlighted what they termed our weapons-grade optimism in hazardous environments. They showed our deep space exploration teams venturing into radiation storms and gravitational anomalies with what appeared to be inadequate shielding and backup systems. The report noted our tendency to proceed with missions even when survival probability calculations dropped below acceptable thresholds, citing what they called a concerning disregard for statistical reality. Exhibit C cataloged our recreational activities, everything from free climbing rock faces without safety equipment to jumping out of perfectly functional aircraft for entertainment. They classified these as non-essential, risk-taking behaviors that serve no evolutionary purpose, expressing particular concern about how we voluntarily engaged in activities that other species would only attempt under extreme duress. The verdict was unanimous. Category red. Permanent quarantine at 50 light-years minimum from any inhabited system, with monitoring buoys to be deployed around the perimeter to ensure compliance. What they called a necessary containment measure, we recognized as a death sentence for galactic curiosity, the systematic isolation of a species that had finally reached the stars only to be told we were too dangerous to be allowed outside our cage. Imagine presenting your species' greatest achievements as evidence of your inherent danger. That's what they did with humanity. The Council's case wasn't based on malice. It was built on our fundamental nature, presented with the dry precision of scientists dissecting a dangerous specimen. They didn't hate us. They just thought we were broken in ways that could break everything else. Each exhibit showed a different facet of human ingenuity interpreted through their risk assessment lens. Exhibit A covered our engineering philosophy. We don't follow manuals. We improvise, adapt, and sometimes hit things until they work. They showed footage of engineers bypassing safety protocols to reroute power during emergencies, calling it systemic disregard for established procedures. They seemed particularly troubled by our habit of using tools for purposes they weren't designed for, like using plasma cutters to open doors or navigation systems to calculate poker odds. Exhibit B documented our exploration patterns. We voluntarily enter hazardous environments with what they classified as reckless curiosity. They had records of our deep-sea explorers venturing into tectonic fissures and our asteroid miners working in radiation, zones that other species would consider suicide missions. The report noted our tendency to proceed when survival probability dropped below 40%, citing concerning optimism in the face of statistical reality. Exhibit C cataloged recreational activities that terrified their actuaries. We climb mountains without safety lines, jump from planes for entertainment, and engage in competitive activities that frequently result in injury. They showed footage of extreme sports and contact sports, noting that we seemed to derive pleasure from voluntary risk-taking. Their analysts couldn't determine the evolutionary advantage of behavior that increased mortality rates for no apparent survival benefit. Exhibit D covered military history. They showed the unsettling pattern of humans weaponizing anything available, from rocks to social media platforms. The presentation included examples of agricultural equipment modified for combat, communication systems hacked for psychological operations, and entertainment media used as propaganda tools. They noted our ability to turn literally anything into a weapon given sufficient motivation. Exhibit E analyzed first contact protocols. We arrive in force and act surprised when it's perceived as threatening. They showed multiple instances where human exploration teams approached new species with overwhelming military escorts for protection, then seemed genuinely confused when the other species interpreted this as aggression. The report described this as cognitive dissonance between stated peaceful intentions and demonstrated capabilities. Taken together, we weren't just dangerous, we were unpredictably, creatively dangerous. The Council saw chaos where we saw problem-solving. They observed recklessness where we demonstrated adaptability. Their analysis was technically correct but fundamentally missed the point. We didn't break systems because we were malicious. We modified them because they weren't working optimally. The same traits that made us dangerous also made us capable of solving problems others considered unsolvable. They were looking at a toolkit and seeing only the potential for destruction, never considering what that toolkit could build. Their simulations didn't just predict we'd cause trouble, they predicted we'd rewrite the rules. The Council's risk assessment team ran thousands of scenarios involving human integration, each one more thorough than the last. They fed every variable into their prediction engines: cultural exchange patterns, technological transfer rates, economic integration models, even psychological compatibility indices. They accounted for everything except the one thing they couldn't quantify: human stubbornness. In 73% of projections, humanity's involvement collapsed at least 3 major civilizations within 50 years, not through military conquest or economic warfare, but through what they termed cultural contamination. Our tendency to question authority, challenge traditions, and propose alternatives apparently had a destabilizing effect comparable to throwing a lit match into a room full of political powder kegs. Their models showed established power structures crumbling, not from external pressure but from internal reevaluation triggered by human influence. 31% of cases showed total galactic collapse through what they called optimistic interference. This was their term for our habit of trying to fix things that weren't technically broken, just inefficient by our standards. The projections showed cascading system failures occurring when humans would improve critical infrastructure without fully understanding the delicate political and cultural balances those systems maintained. One simulation had us streamlining a trade network so effectively that it bankrupted entire sectors that depended on the previous inefficiencies. The remaining scenarios weren't better. They showed human-dominated outcomes not through conquest but through relentless improvement. Their models indicated we cannot accept that something cannot be done, which apparently destabilizes everything. Even our peaceful integration scenarios caused massive cultural shifts that outdated existing governance structures within decades. The numbers were stark. 0 scenarios resulted in modest, manageable change. Every projection ended with either containment or catastrophe. No middle ground existed in their probability matrices. They saw binary outcomes where we saw a spectrum of possibilities. Their risk assessment framework treated change as inherently dangerous, rather than potentially beneficial. The models accounted for disruption, but not for the positive adaptations that might follow. They could calculate the probability of a government collapsing, but not the chance that whatever replaced it might actually be better. Their entire analytical framework was built around maintaining stability, not evaluating whether that stability was worth maintaining. The simulations were technically accurate. They just asked the wrong questions. They measured risk without considering reward, calculated danger without accounting for opportunity. They built perfect models of a galaxy without humans and called any deviation from that baseline a failure state. The projections weren't wrong about what would change. They were wrong about whether that change would be bad.